The day my son handed me an eviction notice in my own kitchen, he would not even look me in the eye. I was at the sink with my hands in warm, soapy water when he set a thin stack of papers on the table where I used to cut his sandwiches into little triangles. For a second, I assumed it was another form he wanted me to sign. Then I saw the first line in heavy black letters. Notice to vacate. My fingers went cold. Across from him, Vanessa leaned on the counter with her arms folded, watching my face the way she watches buyers when she names a price. It is just paperwork, Mom Mark said, his voice stiff. The bank needs it. Vanessa added, it is for your own good. You will be more comfortable somewhere smaller. Smaller. Like I was a chair they needed to move out of the way. I dried my hands, picked up the top page, and read the sentence that shoved the air out of my chest. You must vacate the premises within 30 days. Premises. That was how they described the house where I had rocked Mark through fevers, where my husband Tom and I had argued over numbers at this table until every mortgage bill was paid. Above the stove, the old photo still hung in its chipped frame. Tom on the front porch in his city engineer jacket, holding up the key to this place like a prize. The picture had stayed. The names on the deed had not. 10 minutes earlier, I had been rinsing dishes while Vanessa's voice floated in from the dining room, loud on speakerphone. Honestly, she said she is basically our tenant. Her pension is the rent. I froze with a plate under the tap. Tenant. After decades at the Spokane Public Library and a lifetime of counting every penny to keep this roof over our heads, I had apparently been demoted from mom to tenant in my own home. I was still trying to swallow that word when Mark called my name and the folder appeared. A movement at the doorway pulled my eyes from the notice. Lily stood there, my 14-year-old granddaughter, in her oversized school sweatshirt, her history project crumpled in one hand. "What is that?" she asked, staring at the stack on the table. "Go to your room, this is adult stuff," Mark said without looking at her. Lily did not move. "You cannot kick Grandma out of her own house," she said, slow and clear. Vanessa turned that polished smile on her. "It is not her house anymore, sweetie," she said lightly. "That is the point." The kitchen went quiet. I could hear the refrigerator hum and the old clock tick. I folded the notice once and slid it into the pocket of my cardigan. I did not argue. I did not beg. At that table, my silence was the only thing I still owned. My name is Helen Brooks. I am 68 years old, a widow, and until a few years ago, I was a city librarian in Spokane. My husband Tom worked as a city engineer. We bought this house when Mark was 5 and paid it off the slow way. Between his pension and mine, I received $9,800 a month. That money was supposed to keep me safe. Somewhere along the line, my son and his wife decided it was theirs to manage. Mark is my only child. He used to sleep on the floor beside my bed with his hand on the mattress so he could feel me breathing. Now he stood 3 steps away and let his wife talk about me like a bill. Vanessa sells houses and never misses a chance to remind me she understands money. She knows exactly when my pension comes in, and she and Mark control the account it goes into. To her, I am an income stream that comes with wrinkles. To Lily, I am still just Grandma. While Mark talked that evening about how they had taken over everything so I would not mess it up, his words buzzing around my ears, my thoughts went somewhere he did not know existed. If they had opened my safe deposit box at Washington Credit Union, I thought if they had ever asked what else Tom and I planned for, they would know I am not nearly as helpless as they think. I said nothing. Let them believe their story a little longer. That night, after the dishes were done and their bedroom door clicked shut upstairs, I walked down the hall to the small back room now called my space. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the eviction notice crackling in my pocket with every breath. The hurt was not just about losing 4 walls. It was about knowing my own child had stood in my kitchen and tried to push me out of the life I built. A soft knock came at the door. Before I could answer, Lily slipped inside and closed it firmly behind her. Her face was pale, her jaw tight. In her hands, she held a thick manila folder. "Grandma," she whispered, "I need to show you something." She sat beside me and opened the folder on the faded quilt. Inside were printed pages, a copy of a deed with Mark and Vanessa's names where mine and Tom's had been, email chains with a mortgage broker about a cash-out refinance and possible sale dates, bank statements showing my pension, all $9,800 every month, flowing straight into an account with my son and his wife written on top. "They have been planning this for a year," Lily said. "You are not crazy. My teacher says this is a crime." The words on the page blurred and came back into focus. For months I had told myself I was overreacting, that they were only trying to help. Now the proof sat on my bed in my granddaughter's shaking hands. Something in me that had been shrinking to keep the peace finally stopped. I was 68 years old and my own son was evicting me. But he had not taken everything. He had not taken the truth. And now that my granddaughter had heard it, none of them were ever going to sleep peacefully again. If you have ever felt pushed aside by family over money, stay with me. You are going to want to hear how this ends. 2 years before the eviction notice landed on my kitchen table, my life in North Spokane moved in a quiet rhythm that felt steady and small, the kind of routine a woman builds after loss. And in those days, I woke early to the muted gray mornings, made myself oatmeal, and drove to Safeway for groceries, where the cashier always asked about my retirement, then stopped at Starbucks for the senior discount coffee Tom used to tease me about, and every afternoon I found myself drifting back to the library, even though I no longer worked there, because being surrounded by shelves and the hush of turning pages felt like being held in the only place that still remembered who I used to be. My house in North Spokane was modest but warm, bought in 1990 when Tom and I were young enough to believe we had all the time in the world, and paid off slowly over 25 years of disciplined sacrifice, and the kind of quiet partnership that comes from knowing numbers better than words, since Tom was a city engineer, with a pension that matched mine from the Spokane Public Library, and between the two of us we had built a safety net that should have carried me comfortably into old age. Over the decades, we saved faithfully, putting money into Washington municipal bonds because Tom liked how steady and boring they were, and he always said, "Boring money is safe. Money." Then a few years before he passed, he opened a safe deposit box at Washington Credit Union and added my name on the card, telling me it was only for emergencies, and inside he kept a draft trust he wrote but never finalized, along with a small notebook listing a quiet investment he had made into a row of storage units on the edge of Spokane, a cluster of metal buildings I had never seen, but which sent monthly income into an account. Mark did not know existed a backup plan Tom believed would protect me if everything ever went wrong. I never mentioned those storage units to Mark, not because I distrusted him back then, but because Tom said some things are better kept until absolutely necessary, and I honored that, treating the account and the safe deposit box like a private lifeboat. In early 2022, Mark and Vanessa came for dinner more often, usually on Sundays, when the house still smelled faintly of pot roast, and from the moment Vanessa stepped through the door, she carried the energy of someone who thought she was managing a crisis, instead of visiting family, launching into long monologues about housing prices, interest rates, and how older people really should not handle money alone, because those were different times and scams were everywhere. And it was just common sense to let someone younger take over before something bad happened. I would smile and stir gravy while she talked, but each comment pressed a small bruise somewhere inside me, and the first real sting came when she looked at my checkbook resting near the stove and said with a sugary laugh that if I kept that much in my own account, scammers would love me, because I did not even know how to spot a fake email, which was almost funny. Considering I had taught a class called Internet Safety for seniors at the library for 5 years, explaining phishing scams to people older than me, but she said it with such certainty that Mark nodded along like she was reading my obituary. I brushed it aside, telling myself she was just anxious about money like many people in their 30s, but the line of disrespect had been drawn even if I pretended not to notice. That evening, while I cleared dishes and ran warm water in the sink, Vanessa offered to grab a bottle of wine from the basement, which struck me as odd because the wine rack upstairs was full. Yet before I could answer, she had already disappeared down the stairs, her heels clicking on each step, and a few minutes later, Lily came up looking puzzled, whispering to me that she found Vanessa going through my file cabinet, and when she asked why she was down there, Vanessa just smiled thinly and said somebody has to make sure things are in order, like my life was a cluttered drawer she had to sort. I felt a pinch of unease but forced myself to believe it was nothing, because admitting it was something meant admitting my son had allowed this boundary to dissolve long before tonight. After dessert, I stepped out to water the small herb pots near the back door, and through the thin siding, I heard Mark's voice drifting from the porch, where he thought I could not hear him telling Vanessa in a low tone that my pension was more than they made in a month combined, and if they did not step in, I would waste it. Like the hours of budgeting Tom and I used to do at this very table meant nothing, like I was suddenly incapable of understanding the same numbers I had balanced for 30 years. Vanessa hummed in agreement, confident and sure, the kind of hum people use when they see money that is not theirs yet, but believe will be soon. And in that moment, I understood something I had ignored for months, that their concern was not about my well-being, but about access, about control, about the steady income I represented. And although I stayed silent as always, something in me tightened as I realized they had already begun circling the parts of my life they intended to claim. What I did not know then was that the basement visit was not harmless curiosity, and that Vanessa had already marked the file drawer she planned to revisit, setting into motion a pattern that would eventually unravel into the night. Lily handed me the folder, but in early 2022, I still told myself they were only trying to help, unaware that the seed of injustice had already been planted in the soft soil of family obligation and entitlement. And from that seed, a much darker vine would soon begin to grow. Spring of 2022 arrived with the soft smell of thawing earth and blooming dogwood around the churchyard, and that Sunday I stood beside the long folding tables in the fellowship hall, arranging trays of muffins, the same way I had done every week for nearly 15 years, because volunteering there gave me a sense of purpose after Tom passed, and the congregation always felt like an extended family, until the day my own family turned me into a quiet spectacle without even noticing. The brunch after service was lively, filled with the clatter of silverware and the low hum of familiar voices, and as I poured coffee into paper cups, a small group gathered near me, talking about retirement rising costs and how pensions barely stretch the way they used to, and one woman turned toward me with a kind smile and asked if I must be comfortable with that city pension I had earned after so many years at the library, a question that should have been harmless, but before I could answer, Vanessa slid into the conversation like a blade, her hand brushing my arm lightly as she announced that they actually managed all of that for me now, because I got confused with all the numbers, and the polite laughs that followed felt like warm coffee splashing across my skin. I stood there holding the pot, my smile pinned in place, while the people I saw every week looked at me with new eyes, and Vanessa enjoying the attention added that I used to organize books, but now I would misplace my own checkbook if they let me, and another woman joked that she needed a daughter-in-law like Vanessa to keep her in line, and although they all chuckled and meant it as good fun, I felt something small and old inside me fold in on itself as the familiar sting of being publicly diminished settled across my chest. I tried to brush it off, reminding myself that church folks often tease, but the way Vanessa said it, so casually authoritative, carried a message that spread through the room faster than gossip, painting me as someone who needed supervision in the same community where I had built years of trust and competence, and I could feel the shift in how people glanced at me, as if checking whether the librarian they once asked for help was now drifting toward confusion. Shortly after, Father Allen called us to gather as he liked to do on special Sundays, and he asked if anyone with long-term work experience in public service would share wisdom with the younger members, and he looked right at me with warm expectation, remembering all the years I managed the library budget and taught classes, so I stepped forward modestly and began to speak about allocating limited funds, building community programs, and how careful planning made the difference between a struggling branch and a thriving one. As I talked, I felt myself slipping briefly into the steadiness I used to have, but then I caught a soft whisper beside me. Vanessa leaning toward a woman at her table and saying with bored amusement that I like to think I ran the place, but the city did most of the thinking for me, and the words hit me harder than the earlier jokes, because this time Lily was standing only a few feet away, overhearing every syllable, and I watched her face harden the way it had once done when she saw a classmate bully a smaller kid during recess, attention that always meant she was filing something away for later. I finished my short talk under the weight of those murmured words, pretending not to notice the way Vanessa's comment floated between tables like a stain. But on the drive home, the embarrassment sat in my gut like a stone. And when we pulled into the driveway, I felt the house shrink around me even before stepping inside. After they left that afternoon, leaving behind their usual trail of unsolicited advice and subtle corrections, I walked into my bedroom and opened the old wooden dresser, where Tom kept his most personal things, sliding out the worn leather notebook he had filled with neat engineer handwriting. And as I flipped it open, I reached the page he had labeled storage units with figures carefully noted, showing a total valuation of $850,000 and a rental income of around $3,500 each month, all under my sole ownership, because Tom believed in securing my independence even if I never needed it. I touched the page the way one touches a lifeline, and I whispered to myself that as long as I had that, I was not at their mercy, despite how they spoke to me, and they had no idea how much more secure I was than they assumed. But even with that knowledge glowing quietly in my chest, I still closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer, because I did not want to be the mother who confronted her son with suspicion, and there was a part of me still unwilling to believe he would ever take advantage of me. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, the hum of the refrigerator matching the hum in my mind as I replayed every moment from church, every smirk, every patronizing comment, every time Vanessa positioned herself as my caretaker in front of people who once respected me. And as the hours stretched, I felt the sharp ache of being reduced in public, the specific pain women my age know too well when the younger generation treats them like relics instead of people with history, with skill, with authority, earned by years of quiet labor. I thought of all the women in that fellowship hall who laughed politely, women who probably knew the humiliation of having their intelligence dismissed by their own families, and I knew in that moment that something in me had shifted, because while the world saw me as a fading librarian, only the audience of my private life knew the truth that I held a nearly $1 million asset my own son and his wife had never touched. Never. That truth sat with me, like a small bright ember in the dark, a reminder that my story was not going to end the way they imagined, and the humiliation of that Sunday would be the beginning of something neither of them were prepared for. Because while they saw a woman slipping, I was beginning to see exactly how far they intended to push me, and how much further I might have to push back. Summer slipped into fall in 2022, and the small humiliations from church had barely begun to fade when Mark came over one afternoon with his laptop tucked under his arm, wearing the expression he uses when he thinks he is being responsible. And he sat at my kitchen table where Tom used to calculate our taxes, and told me gently that for safety, we should route my pension into a joint account with him, so he could make sure the bills were paid, because scammers target seniors and online banking can be confusing. And before I could gather my thoughts, Vanessa stepped in, with her polished certainty saying it was just an extra layer of protection, and I did not want to click the wrong link and lose everything. And the way she said everything made it sound as though I already had 1 foot in cognitive decline. I hesitated, but Mark smiled in that soft, paternal way grown children sometimes use when they believe they know more than their parents, and he pulled up an online form already filled out with both of our names, while Vanessa hovered behind him, pointing to the highlighted sections as if guiding a child through homework and against the small tightening in my stomach. I typed my name, not fully understanding the transfer permissions until the confirmation message flashed, and I realized my entire $9,800 each month would now land in an account Mark and Vanessa commanded like captains of a ship I once owned. At first I told myself it would only simplify things, but the changes came swiftly and quietly, and each one cut deeper than the last beginning, with the day I saw a pair of comfortable walking shoes on sale at the mall and mentioned them to Vanessa, who glanced at my feet and said with a clipped smile that my old ones looked perfectly fine, and there was no point wasting money when I barely went anywhere, and the words stuck to my ribs like cold glue, even though I tried to brush them away with a laugh. Then at church, when a flyer came around asking for donations to the Children's Book Fund, I reached into my purse and thought about contributing $100 the way I had done every year since I retired. But when I mentioned it to Mark, he said they were already doing enough for me, and I should hold on to my extra spending until things stabilized, though nothing in my life had ever been more stable than my pension before he touched it. When fall arrived and Spokane's chill crept into the house, I nudged the thermostat up to 70 degrees, like Tom and I always had, because the house felt warmer with a gentle heat humming through the vents. Yet the next morning, I found a note taped directly over the thermostat in Vanessa's neat handwriting, saying, "Do not touch energy is not free." And when I whispered that it was a little cold, she sighed loudly from across the room and told me to put on another sweater. Because did I have any idea what the power bill looked like now? And the shame bloomed in my chest so quickly that I simply nodded and walked to my bedroom to pull on the heaviest cardigan I owned. Even in the small moments when Lily was present, the mockery slipped out so easily. Like the afternoon Vanessa leaned over the kitchen island and joked that I was their favorite tax write-off, while Mark laughed and did not correct her, and I watched Lily's jaw clench the way it had in the fellowship hall, but she said nothing, holding her silence like a secret she was not ready to release. That night, as the cold settled deeper and the ache in my shoulders tightened, I sat at my computer after everyone had gone to bed and remembered that my name was still listed on the electric company account because I had opened it decades ago. And with slow, careful clicks, I logged in, confirmed my identity, and changed the household to a cheaper plan that balanced the usage differently. A small adjustment that removed their precious full-time climate control and distributed limits in a way that would irritate them without ever revealing I had been there. And when the next bill arrived a few weeks later, I listened from the hallway as Vanessa complained loudly that the rate structure made no sense, and Mark grumbled that the power company must have changed something without asking, and both of them circled explanations like bees around a flower, but never once suspected my involvement. That small private act of rebellion warmed me more than the thermostat ever could, a reminder that even when they tightened control around my pension and money, some corners of my life still answered to me. As summer faded fully into autumn and the days shortened, I began to keep a quiet record of everything that happened, opening a small spiral notebook and writing the date each time Vanessa made a comment about my memory, or Mark dismissed my suggestions, or they restricted something that had once been mine without question. And though I told myself the notes were only for clarity, a way to stay organized deep down, I knew I was building something sturdier than recollection, an archive of truth, in case it would one day be needed. I did not yet understand how far their entitlement would stretch, or how much they planned to claim under the guise of helping. But the small voice inside me that kept Tom's memory alive whispered that evidence matters, that patterns matter, And as I closed the notebook each night and slipped it beneath my pillow, I felt myself shifting imperceptibly from victim to witness, collecting the small shards of every insult while they remained convinced I was too old or too tired to notice. By the time the new year settled over Spokane and 2023 unfolded in its usual gray chill, the shift in my own household had become something I could almost taste in the air, a sour film of entitlement layered over every conversation, and it began with the way Vanessa casually introduced me to people, as though I were a dependent relative. They graciously allowed to occupy spare space, saying with bright confidence that this was Helen, and she lived with them now, and they basically covered everything for me because managing finances at my age could be overwhelming. And every time she said it, my stomach tightened, even though I kept the polite smile stretched across my face. One morning at the bank, I accompanied them because Mark wanted to discuss a minor change on his account. And while we waited for the teller, Vanessa laughed lightly to the young woman behind the counter and joked that I was their in-house tenant, and they collected my pension as rent, and the teller gave one of those customer service chuckles that fill the silence but do nothing to address the disrespect laced so plainly in the air, and my cheeks burned as if someone had pressed a heating pad against them while Mark stood beside us, scrolling his phone as if the remark had been perfectly natural. The humiliation clung to me through the week until the diner scene carved itself into my memory with painful clarity during a cheap family dinner on a Saturday night where I studied the menu carefully and chose the least expensive item because I knew what would happen if I dared go beyond what Vanessa deemed appropriate. Yet when the plates were cleared and the waitress brought the bill, Vanessa lifted her voice just enough for the nearby tables to hear, declaring that my pension had paid for the meal. So technically I was treating them, and wasn't that thoughtful? And Mark laughed while Lily stared down at her hands, her silence heavy with embarrassment on my behalf. When I reached for my wallet to leave a private tip, wanting to offer the young waitress something kind since she had refilled my water with genuine warmth, Vanessa's hand closed around my wrist in a firm grip as she said they had already added gratuity, and there was no need for me to flash cash I did not even manage, and the room seemed to shrink around me as I withdrew my hand slowly and tucked the wallet back into my purse. The shame doubled on itself, like a twisted rope pulling me downward, because it was one thing to be mocked privately, but another entirely to be treated like a child in front of strangers, stripped of agency over the very money I had earned across decades of service at the library. Yet even in the midst of that humiliation, a small ember of power remained tucked safely away, where neither Mark nor Vanessa had ever bothered to look, and it flickered to life. The afternoon I opened my email and saw a message from the manager of the storage complex Tom and I had purchased so long ago, reporting that rental income had increased due to updated pricing structures. And when I logged into the separate account, where those payments accumulated, the balance had climbed past $1,100,000 a number, so large and quiet it made me sit down at the kitchen table and stare at the screen, with a mix of grief and grim satisfaction. They had no idea this money existed. They had spent months painting me as a burden they carried as a fragile woman, incapable of navigating a banking app, yet I was sitting on a 7-figure asset they were too arrogant to suspect, and that knowledge settled in my bones like a warm shield. I closed the laptop gently, almost tenderly, and went about the rest of the day in silence, careful not to disturb the illusion they relied on, because I had begun to understand that being underestimated was its own kind of protection. A few days later, while Vanessa loudly told a neighbor on speakerphone that they were the only ones keeping me afloat, I excused myself to my bedroom, dialed the library where I had spent 32 years of my life, and quietly arranged an anonymous donation of $5,000 from the storage income to renovate the children's reading corner. Hearing the director's voice brighten with gratitude and the contrast between that quiet impact and the suffocating narrative at home strengthened something inside me. Vanessa never knew. Mark never wondered. They carried on believing their fabricated version of reality while I preserved a sliver of independence that neither of them could touch. But the illusion they projected outward began to crack the night Lily approached me in the hallway, her voice soft yet steady as she asked whether I truly had no control over my own money, and her eyes searched mine with a mixture of suspicion and hurt, as though she could not reconcile the grandmother who had always been steady and capable with the woman her parents described. I felt heat rise to my face as the shame from the diner twisted with something sharper, something like the early stirrings of resolve, and though I did not yet dare tell her everything, I managed to whisper that sometimes things are not what they seem, and that I was working on a plan vague as the words were because I was still shaping the pieces in my mind. She nodded slowly, not fully understanding, yet there was a faint flicker of trust in her expression, and when she slipped back into her room, I exhaled for what felt like the first time all week. The world saw me as an older woman living off her son, fumbling through life. But the truth pulsed beneath the surface, a quiet engine gaining strength with every passing day. And while Mark and Vanessa built their false narrative louder and louder, I began preparing in silence, gathering small tools of resistance, testing boundaries they believed they owned, knowing that the moment would come when the mask they forced on me would crack beyond repair, and they would finally see the woman they had dismissed for far too long. The fall happened on a Wednesday afternoon in the dull heat of June, when the house felt unusually silent, and I was carrying a basket of laundry down the stairs because Vanessa said the upstairs hallway looked cluttered with my things, and I remember gripping the handrail with one hand while adjusting the basket with the other. The carpeted step shifting under my foot just enough to make my balance tilt, and in the next breath, my knee slammed hard against the edge of a stair, while my palm scraped painfully along the railing as I tried to catch myself, and the shock of the impact sent a cold wave through my whole body, sharp enough that for a moment I could not breathe. I sat there on the step with the laundry scattered around me like pieces of myself that had burst loose, my knee throbbing and my wrist already swelling, and when Mark and Vanessa finally appeared at the top of the stairs after I called their names twice, their expressions carried more annoyance than concern, as though my pain had inconvenienced their afternoon plans rather than alarmed them. Vanessa crossed her arms and said this was exactly why I should not roam around because I was going to injure myself and increase their medical bills, and her voice was firm and clipped, as if she were arguing about a damaged appliance rather than a person who had just hit the floor. Instead of helping me up gently or taking me to urgent care, she and Mark exchanged a look that seemed to say that I was making things complicated again, and Mark fetched a bottle of cheap, over-the-counter pain pills from the bathroom cabinet, while Vanessa told me to rest for a few days and the swelling would go down, and the casual dismissal in her tone made something inside me shrink further. I tried to explain that my knee felt unstable and my wrist hurt every time I moved my fingers, but Mark interrupted and said, "We may need to consider a nursing home if this keeps happening, because my falling was turning into a liability." And when he said that word, it felt like someone had stamped a label across my forehead, reducing me from mother to burden in a single sentence. Later that evening, as I sat on the edge of my bed with an ice pack tied to my knee, I heard Vanessa on the phone telling someone that she had temporarily locked my Facebook account to prevent scammers from messaging me and that I should not be online unsupervised. And the next morning, I discovered she had deleted half my contacts, including the women from my book club, who often checked in with me. When I reached for my phone to call my closest friend Susan, I realized the phone plan had been changed again, and many of my stored numbers were gone, leaving me with a device that felt like a hollow version of connection rather than a lifeline. The humiliation of being isolated settled over me like dust that refused to be brushed off, and for the first time I started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I was becoming more trouble than worth. Maybe the long years of independence and competence had faded to the point that the world moved faster than I could keep up, and the thought lodged itself in my mind in a way that frightened me. I tried to busy myself with small tasks around the house, moving slower because of the pain, but each time Vanessa saw me, she remarked that I should not strain anything, because she could not risk another incident, and those words reinforced the invisible walls closing in around me. But the twist arrived unexpectedly one afternoon when Lily came home from school earlier than usual and walked into the living room just as Vanessa was chatting with our neighbor Karen on the porch. And I overheard Vanessa telling her that my pension barely covered my own expenses, and they were constantly topping things up out of generosity. The lie hit me like another blow to the knee, but what struck me more was the look on Lily's face as she froze in the doorway, because she had overheard Mark brag only a few months earlier that my pension was almost $10,000 a month, and that it was plenty to keep the house running if he managed it properly. Lily's eyes darted back and forth as she processed the contradiction, and I saw the first spark of doubt flicker behind her expression, as though a loose thread had suddenly appeared in the story her parents had been weaving for so long. She stayed quiet, but her gaze lingered on Vanessa's face with a new sharpness, and I realized Lily was beginning to see something she had not noticed before, something that might become the first small crack in the image they had constructed. That evening, while I sat alone in my room with the curtains drawn, the ache in my knee pulsing as a constant reminder of how vulnerable I had become under my own roof, I whispered into the stillness, asking Tom what he would tell me to do if he were still here, and the memory of the safe deposit box surfaced in my mind like a distant lighthouse I had been too afraid to approach. I could almost picture the faded key tucked into the pocket of my cardigan, and though I still did not act on it, the thought lingered longer than before, steady and persistent like a quiet call, reminding me of a truth I had nearly forgotten. For now, I sat in the dim light, overwhelmed by a sense of being silenced in my own life, and yet haunted by the realization that Lily was starting to notice the gaps in her parents' claims, and even if I felt small and shoved aside the seeds of doubt, had been planted seeds that might one day grow into something powerful enough to break through the darkness that had been gathering around me since the moment Mark and Vanessa began taking control. By late 2023, the days were already shrinking into early darkness, and the house felt tighter around me like the walls had moved in a few inches while I was not looking. And one evening, I sat in my room with the door almost closed, my knee still stiff if I moved too quickly, when raised voices drifted down the hallway from the kitchen where Mark and Vanessa were talking, in the way people talk when they think everyone else is either asleep or too far away to matter. And although I tried not to listen, the words carried clearly. Vanessa saying that once the refinance went through and they sold this place, they would finally have enough to upgrade to the house she had been eyeing on the South Hill, and that I could go to assisted living because my pension and whatever was left from the sale would cover it nicely, as if I were a line item in a spreadsheet, instead of a person who had spent her life making this house a home. Mark's answer cut through me even more because he sounded calm and reasonable when he replied that they just needed the eviction notice filed, and the lawyer had said it would be simpler that way, legal and clean. And hearing my own son discuss evicting me from the kitchen I had scrubbed for decades made the air in my room feel thin. I did not know then that Lily was standing just around the corner from the kitchen entrance, frozen in place as she listened, her hand still holding the glass of water she had come to refill, and she later told me that she felt as if someone had yanked the floor out from under her, because in that moment she realized her parents were not just being overprotective or controlling, they were actively planning to treat her grandmother like a piece of property to be moved and monetized. And the shock of that understanding burned away whatever remained of her childish trust. That night, Lily waited until the house was quiet, until the dishwasher had stopped humming and the light under her parents' door clicked off, and then she slipped down the hallway in her socks, heart pounding, and crept into the small room Mark used as a home office, the one he always shut when he did not want questions about what he was doing on the computer. And because she had grown up with technology in her hands, it was nothing for her to wake his laptop and enter the password. She had seen him type more than once, a lazy combination of Lily's birthday and their street number. She told me later that her palms were sweating as she clicked through his folders, but anger steadied her enough to keep going until she found a scan of the deed in a folder simply titled, "House the image opening on the screen with only Mark and Vanessa's names listed as owners where mine and Tom's had once been," and for a long moment she just stared, her ears ringing, understanding suddenly how real the betrayal had already become. From there, the trail was not difficult to follow emails with a mortgage broker, talking about a cash-out refinance numbers spelled out in neat bullet points describing how much equity they could pull and how an assisted living facility would be a smart way to ensure my pension kept flowing toward my care while they moved into their dream home. And the more she scrolled, the more her stomach turned. She clicked into the online banking tab and saw the statement showing my pension, $9,800, hitting the joint account like clockwork each month, followed by large transfers out that were not labeled with my needs but with theirs. And she understood in a way she had never dared consider that these were not hypothetical discussions. They were already spending money that was supposed to secure my final years. Somewhere in the spreadsheets, she found one file that made her throat close, a document where Mark had calculated potential sale prices for the house at different market conditions, subtracting estimated payoff amounts and closing costs. And in one column, he had written college fund for Lily with a question mark next to potential figures, then deleted the entries, judging by the faint ghost of auto-save comments, as if my home and security were negotiable chips on a board he could assign or erase, depending on what suited him that week. Lily printed everything she could soberly identify as important page after page, spitting quietly from the old printer, and she stacked the documents carefully into a plain manila folder, the kind I used to use in the library for patron files. And when the last page slid into place, she closed the laptop, turned off the office light, and slipped back into bed, clutching the folder to her chest under the covers, as though it were a shield. The next afternoon, when Mark and Vanessa were both out, she came into my room and shut the door behind her, her face pale and set in a way that made my heart jerk, and without a word she handed me the folder, telling me I needed to sit down before I opened it, which is how I found myself on the edge of my bed, with my hands shaking as I unfolded the flap and began to read the first page. The scanned deed with only their names, the email chains about cashing out equity, the bank statements showing my pension diverted like a river rerouted through someone else's land. Each line tightened my chest a little more, but it was the spreadsheet Lily pointed to that finally snapped something inside me. The one where my home had been reduced to sale price, scenarios, debt subtraction, and an almost flippant column that once held possible numbers for her education, before it was erased, as if even the idea of my sacrifice benefiting her had been deemed unnecessary. For the first time since this all began, I did not think maybe I am overreacting, or maybe I am too much trouble. The words that rose in my throat were hard and clear, and I heard myself say out loud, "This is theft," and hearing my own voice name, it jolted me in a way nothing else had, because it took the fog of confusion they had wrapped around me and tore it open. Lily watched my face carefully and then with a deep breath told me that she had already mentioned pieces of what she suspected to her civics and history teacher, Mrs. Powell, a woman who had given a whole lesson on elder financial abuse and how family members sometimes exploit older relatives under the guise of care. And she said when she told her teacher about the pension and the way I had fallen without being taken seriously, about the jokes at church, and the way Vanessa spoke in front of neighbors, Mrs. Powell's expression had gone very still. According to Lily, her teacher had said that what she described sounded serious, that there were laws about this sort of thing, and that if I was willing, she could help connect us to legal aid resources that specialized in protecting seniors from financial exploitation. Sitting there with the folder on my lap, my knee aching faintly, my heart hammering in my chest, I realized that the battle I had been too afraid to even imagine might actually be possible, and that I was no longer alone inside this house, because my granddaughter had not only seen the truth, she'd gathered proof and quietly summoned an ally from outside our family's carefully controlled story, an ally who knew the language of rights and consequences that I had spent too long convincing myself would never apply to my own son. The first week of January 2024 arrived with a frost that glazed the sidewalks in Spokane and made my knee ache more sharply than usual, and Lily insisted that it was time for me to meet her teacher properly, not in the quiet hints and half whispers we had exchanged so far. So one morning she accompanied me to the school parking lot where Mrs. Powell waited beside her car with a wool scarf wrapped tightly around her neck and a look in her eyes that told me she already knew more than I wanted anyone to know. She greeted me gently and asked if I felt comfortable riding with her to the senior legal aid clinic downtown, explaining that the attorneys there specialized in protecting older adults from financial harm and that the first consultation was free, and something about the steadiness in her voice made it difficult for me to refuse, even though my heart pounded the entire drive. The clinic was tucked inside a modest brick building near the county courthouse, its waiting room lined with pamphlets about wills, scams, and housing rights, and after a short wait, a young attorney named Ethan Cole stepped out and introduced himself, his posture calm but focused as he ushered us into a small office with a single window facing the parking lot. When I handed him the manila folder Lily had assembled, he skimmed the pages at first with the brisk rhythm of someone accustomed to sorting minor disputes, but the moment he reached the deed transfer and the refinance emails, his brow tightened and his tone shifted, and he finally looked up and said plainly that this was not a misunderstanding. This was calculated exploitation, and hearing those words spoken out loud by someone trained to identify wrongdoing made the room feel suddenly brighter, as though the fog I had been walking through had thinned. He asked if I had been seen by a doctor recently, and when I shook my head, he explained that documenting the physical effects of financial neglect was important, that injuries like my fall or symptoms like fatigue or weight loss mattered legally, and he insisted on scheduling a full medical evaluation for me at a clinic a few blocks away. Mrs. Powell drove us there, while Ethan sent over the notes, and the doctor who examined me was careful and thorough, checking my blood pressure, twice asking about my diet, noticing the way I winced when I put weight on my knee, and ordering blood work to evaluate vitamin levels. When she returned with the results, she said my vitamin D was low, and I had lost a few pounds since my last checkup 2 years earlier. And she wrote in my chart that limited access to funds for proper care had contributed to inconsistent nutrition and lack of adequate heating. And those words stung deeply because they confirmed on paper what I had tried for months to pretend was just a minor discomfort rather than a sign of the life I was being forced into. Ethan later told me that documentation like this was not just medical proof, but a protective anchor, something that could stand beside my testimony and show the court that the conditions I had endured were real and measurable. After the appointment, we returned to the legal clinic where Ethan asked if there were any assets my son and daughter-in-law might not know about, any accounts, property, or investments that could help me regain control of my life. And I paused for a long moment because speaking about the storage units or the bonds or the draft trust felt like exposing a wound. Yet I finally murmured that my husband and I had prepared for some things they never bothered to ask about, and he nodded confidently and said that was enough for now, that we could go through the details together when I felt ready, especially once I retrieved the documents from the safe deposit box at the credit union. For the first time in months, I felt the faintest rise inside my chest, like a breath that reached deeper, because someone believed me. Someone understood the shape of my pain without dismissing it, and someone had a plan to stop what was happening to me. It was Ethan who suggested my first small act of self-protection, though he smiled when I called it revenge, because to me, it felt like a quiet reclaiming of air that had been stolen from my lungs. He asked whether Mark or Vanessa were using any of my old credit cards, and I told him that an old Visa I rarely touched anymore had been added to some of their accounts years earlier for emergencies, which over time turned into paying for little luxuries like subscription boxes and streaming services. With Ethan guiding me through each step, I called the credit card company and explained that I needed to remove the authorized user from the account. And when the representative asked if I wanted to close the card entirely, I said yes, feeling a strange surge of energy when she confirmed the cancellation. Ethan told me that I had done nothing wrong, that it was my card and my right to protect it. But I still felt a small electric tremor of satisfaction, imagining the ripple effect it might cause. That ripple revealed itself 3 weeks later when I overheard Vanessa in the kitchen, yelling in frustration because Netflix had declined. Then Hulu, then the monthly beauty box she loved so much, and she kept repeating the same question, why is everything declining, until Mark tried calling the bank only to be told the authorized user had been removed and the card had been closed by the primary account holder. When they confronted me in the living room, I kept my hands folded calmly in my lap and said perhaps the bank had gotten confused. After all, I was old and easily mixed up, at least according to what Vanessa told people, and Lily nearly choked on her laughter before leaving the room under the pretense of helping with homework. It was such a small disruption in the grand scheme of things, yet it felt like planting a seed in the soil of my own dignity, a reminder that they could not control every corner of my life, no matter how tightly they tried to grip it. Narrator voice inside me nudged that if anyone watching my story had ever wished they could quietly pull the plug on someone draining them, they should type enough in the comments so others would know they were not alone. Because sometimes even tiny acts of defiance carried enough weight to keep a person from collapsing under all the years of silence they had endured. That thought warmed me more than the thickest sweater. By the end of our next meeting, Ethan leaned back in his chair and told me gently but firmly that we were going to do more than stop the bleeding. We were going to make sure they regretted every dollar they took, but he needed me to keep everything secret a while longer, because the element of surprise could shape the entire outcome. Hearing those words spoken with such calm determination marked the quiet turn of a tide I had believed might never shift again. And for the first time in a very long time, I walked out of the clinic, feeling the ground beneath my feet, steadying as though the path ahead was no longer a dark tunnel, but the early edge of something brighter that had been waiting for me to claim it. A few quiet weeks passed after the first meeting with Ethan, weeks where I felt something inside me stretching and waking, as though a part of my spirit that had been curled into a corner for months was finally uncurling. And one cold Thursday morning, he called and said it was time to visit Washington Credit Union because he needed to see whatever Tom had left behind, so I put on my heaviest coat and met him in the parking lot where the air smelled like snow waiting to fall. The teller at the front desk recognized me from years ago when Tom and I used to deposit checks together, and she greeted me with a softness that made my throat tighten as she led us to a small room in the back where the safe deposit boxes were kept behind a metal door that buzzed when it unlocked. I slipped the thin key from the inside pocket of my purse, the one I had kept hidden even from myself, and when the drawer slid out with a gentle metallic scrape, I felt the weight of decades settle into my hands because everything Tom had ever prepared for me was lying quietly inside this narrow steel box, waiting for the moment I would finally need its protection. I placed the folders on the table one by one, smoothing them with my palm because the paper still carried Tom's handwriting in the margins, and Ethan sat across from me, with the careful attention of someone handling something both fragile and powerful. At the top of the stack lay the original deed to the house, the one with my name and Tom's, written in ink before Mark had ever dreamt of replacing it with his own, and seeing it again made my chest tighten, because it reminded me that the home they had tried to take from me had once been built on love and sweat, not entitlement. Beneath it was the draft trust that Tom had created years earlier, but never finalized a document outlining his wishes with the clarity that only a man who believed in fairness could have written, noting that the house and our savings were meant for me and for Lily, and that Mark would only receive anything if he showed he could treat me with care, a condition that now felt bitterly ironic in the most painful way. Ethan read the note, slowly shaking his head as he traced the lines with his finger, and when he turned the page to the contract for the storage units, his eyebrows rose sharply, because the newest statement showed they were now valued at nearly $1.2 million and generating almost $4,000 a month in income, all under my name alone. He looked at me with a stunned sort of admiration and said they had no idea I was sitting on a seven-figure asset, and I let out a small dry laugh, because to Mark and Vanessa, I had always been just the old woman who used to organize books, the harmless librarian who would never know enough to protect herself. We spent the next hour building the framework of a new plan while the folder lay open between us, like a map leading out of a dark forest, and Ethan explained that the smartest way to ensure my safety and preserve everything Tom had intended was to create a new irrevocable trust, one they could not alter or challenge, placing the old house, if we regained it along with the storage units and all the municipal bonds into it, so everything would be shielded from any claims Mark or Vanessa might try to make. He said Lily should be the primary beneficiary with 50%, and the rest should go to a fund supporting older adults in Spokane who had been financially exploited, which made something warm bloom behind my ribs because it felt like a way to honor all the years I had worked with people who needed quiet help. He also said that in the will we would leave Mark and Vanessa exactly $1, a symbolic gesture that courts recognized as intentional disinheritance, and hearing that made me sit a little straighter, because for once, the consequences matched the harm. There was a steadiness in Ethan's tone as he laid out each step, and while fear fluttered in my chest, something stronger pressed against it, something that felt like the first solid piece of ground I had stood on in a long time. After we left the credit union, Ethan suggested a small but effective step that would keep Mark and Vanessa off balance without putting me at risk, and he reminded me that Vanessa had been renting out the basement on Airbnb without proper permits even after the HOA had warned her something I had learned by overhearing her brag about the cash she made from it. With his guidance, we drafted an anonymous letter to the HOA and the city code office listing the short-term rental dates and the address, a simple factual statement that violated no laws, and 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived addressed to the household with a stamped notice from the city threatening fines if any further unapproved rentals occurred. Vanessa stormed around the kitchen that afternoon, complaining that someone must be targeting them, and she had to cancel all of her upcoming Airbnb bookings. And while she paced and gripped her phone, I sat in the armchair with my tea, hiding my satisfaction behind a neutral expression, thinking how strange it felt to claim even a tiny sliver of justice in the very home where I had been silenced for so long. The momentum continued building like a low, rolling thunder that had finally found its voice. And as Ethan reviewed the documents again, he leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful look before telling me that we were not just protecting me, we were going to show everyone exactly what Mark and Vanessa had done in a way they could not hide from. And that sentence sent a chill of anticipation through me because it hinted at something larger than private justice, something that would carry the truth into the open, where their excuses and careful performances could not shield them. I nodded slowly because the idea of exposing what they had done was terrifying and liberating all at once, like opening a window in a room that had been sealed shut for far too long. And even though I could not yet imagine what that exposure would look like, I felt in my bones that the ground had shifted in my favor. By the time I drove home that afternoon, the winter sun was already sinking, turning the streets below into a soft wash of pale gold, and I thought about how Tom had always said that a plan built on truth would outlast any storm. And as I watched the last of the light catch the rooftops of Spokane, I finally understood what he meant, because for the first time since Mark handed me that eviction notice, I no longer felt like I was being swept away by someone else's current. Instead, I was finally steering my own direction, armed with the knowledge that I was not powerless, that I was not alone, and that my quiet life as a librarian had never made me weak. It had made me patient, observant, and ready for the moment when my voice would matter again. By early spring of 2024, the air in Spokane carried that damp promise of thaw, where the sidewalks glistened from melting frost and the branches along the park trails showed the first tight buds. And during one of our regular meetings, Ethan told me it was time to introduce my story to a wider circle, not by naming myself, but by letting the truth breathe in a room where others who had lived similar patterns could recognize it. He connected me with the Spokane Senior Resource Center, where the director invited me to speak anonymously at a community workshop on elder financial abuse, a session they planned to host in the very library where I had worked for more than 3 decades. And something about returning to that building felt both frightening and strangely comforting, because it was the last place where I had felt respected before everything began to unravel. When the day arrived, I walked into the library's small meeting room with its familiar fluorescent lights and the faint smell of printed pages, and I noticed several faces from my old church among the attendees, even though I kept my gaze lowered, at first reminding myself that I was here only as a storyteller called A Friend We Are Helping. Ethan sat in the back corner taking notes while Mrs. Powell gave a short introduction about the rising cases of elder exploitation, and then she gestured toward me, and I began speaking in a steady voice that surprised me because it did not tremble the way I feared it might. I described the situation as if it had happened to someone else, saying that she trusted her family to help with bills and digital tasks, saying that her pension was nearly $10,000 a month, and she believed she would be safe, saying that her son eventually moved the deed into his name without full explanation and later handed her an eviction notice in her own kitchen. And as the words left my mouth, I could feel the room stilling, as if the air itself leaned closer. People exchanged glances, some frowning, others whispering quietly, because the details were too specific to be brushed aside, and I saw one woman nudge her friend and tilt her head the way people do when they recognize something long before they are willing to say it out loud. Unbeknownst to me, one of my old co-workers from the library had slipped her phone into her bag with the camera angled up, recording the portion where I explained how the pension was diverted into a joint account and how every request for basic personal spending was treated as a burden. And she later admitted she felt compelled to share it because the story struck too close to home. As I spoke, I felt something loosening in my chest, like a tightly knotted rope finally giving way, and when I finished, the room remained quiet for several seconds before a few people nodded and murmured the kind of soft affirmation that comes only from understanding born of lived experience. The recording made its way to Facebook faster than I could have imagined, appearing first in a group called Spokane Moms Over 40, where someone posted the clip with a caption that said, "This story feels too familiar, and I think we need to talk about it." And below it, the comments began piling up, some saying, "This sounds like Helen from St. Mark's Church." Others asking, is not her son married to Vanessa from the real estate office on Division? And within hours, the video spread to Neighborhood Watch North Spokane, where conversations tend to take on a life of their own. People speculated, debated, cross-referenced details they remembered from church brunches and community gatherings, and while no one named me directly in the first wave, the pattern of familiarity rolled through the comments like a slow-rising tide. Several users expressed outrage that any family would do such a thing to someone who had worked her whole life, and more than one person shared their own experience of being pressured by adult children or relatives who saw pensions or property as an easy solution to their own financial frustrations. What happened next felt almost surreal, because one of Vanessa's own friends, noticing the chatter, tagged her directly under the video with a short comment asking, "Is this about your mother-in-law? Because it sounds exactly like things you have said." And once the tag appeared, dozens of notifications flooded Vanessa's phone. Within hours, Vanessa's inbox filled with messages, some bluntly asking for her side of the story, others accusing her of taking advantage of a vulnerable family member, and others simply saying, "I hope this is not you, but if it is, you need to fix it." Ethan assured me there was nothing to worry about because I had not posted anything, nor had I told anyone to do so, and the community had simply responded to the truth in its own organic way. But still, I sat on my bed that evening with my hands folded, feeling the strange weight of watching a wave form without lifting a finger to start it. Vanessa crumbled faster than I ever expected under the sudden scrutiny, because her carefully polished image as the attentive daughter-in-law who managed her husband's aging mother began cracking publicly, and she spent hours sending frantic messages explaining that the story was exaggerated or misinterpreted, or that people were spreading rumors. But the more she tried to control the narrative, the more people pointed out details that matched things she had said in passing jokes she had made about managing my pension, or the time she had referred to me as their in-house tenant. And by the next morning, her social media accounts were restricted because she could not keep up with the backlash. The ripple hit her workplace soon after, when the real estate office where she worked received a link to the video from a concerned former client who asked whether this was the same Vanessa who had helped them sell their home 2 years earlier. And when her supervisor called her in, he looked at her with the tight expression of someone balancing liability with reputation, and told her they could not have their agents tied to elder abuse scandals, especially not when the local Facebook groups had already begun mapping the story back to her name. She tried insisting it was all a misunderstanding, but the manager reminded her that perception mattered in real estate, and even the appearance of unethical behavior could permanently stain the trust of clients, which meant she would need to take a leave while they reviewed the situation. Meanwhile, I spent those days feeling both exposed and protected in a strange mixture, because although I had spoken anonymously, the truth had a way of tracing its own outline in the world, and people who knew me well enough could see its shape clearly. The mini revenge blossomed quietly inside me as I imagined Vanessa scrolling through comments that no longer treated her as the perfect daughter-in-law she always claimed to be. And though I was not someone who celebrated the misfortune of others, I could not deny that something in me felt steadier, knowing the community was seeing her through a clearer lens. In the midst of it, I heard the narrator voice inside me whisper the question I knew others would recognize, asking if you are still watching. Tell me in the comments, would you go public if it meant losing your child but gaining your freedom? Because the line between secrecy and silence is thin, and sometimes stepping into the light is the only way to reclaim your own life. As the Facebook storm continued gathering force, it became clear that the pressure forming around Mark and Vanessa was not just emotional but social, a type of accountability that rose before any legal process could even begin. And as I watched, from the quiet of my room, I realized that the story had expanded beyond our family walls and into a conversation much larger than us, one that made it harder for them to hide behind polished smiles and polite church greetings. By the end of that week, the community had already decided what it believed, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the weight of isolation lift slightly from my shoulders, because the truth was finally moving in the open where it belonged. By midsummer of 2024, the air in Spokane carried that dry heat that settles over the city, like a heavy blanket, the kind that makes the pavement shimmer in the afternoons and turns every errand into something that feels slightly unreal. And in the midst of that heat, Ethan moved forward with the plan he had been shaping for months. He filed a civil suit demanding the return of my home and reimbursement for every month of pension Mark and Vanessa had funneled into their joint account, and he submitted a separate complaint to the state real estate board detailing Vanessa's conduct, attaching excerpts of the refinance emails, witness statements from the workshop video, and notes from the medical assessment that documented the consequences of financial neglect. When the court date arrived, I dressed carefully in a soft blue blouse Tom had once said brought out the warmth in my eyes, and Lily came with me, holding my hand on the steps leading to the courthouse, as though she were the one steadying me, even though I knew the truth was that we were steadying each other. The hearing room was small, lined with beige walls and rows of wooden benches that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and when the judge entered, I felt my heartbeat thrum in my ears. Ethan began by presenting the folder Lily had assembled page after page, showing the transfers, the refinance preparations, the deeds signed without proper explanation. The emails where Mark and Vanessa discussed selling the house and placing me in assisted living to free up equity. And as he spoke, his voice carried a firm clarity that made the facts hard to ignore. He handed over the medical reports next, the ones where the doctor had detailed my vitamin deficiencies, my weight loss, and the impact of inconsistent heating on my health. And the judge nodded slowly, as she read, occasionally glancing up at me with an expression that felt almost protective. Ethan then referenced the draft trust Tom had written years before, explaining how Mark and Vanessa had taken advantage of its existence to suggest that transferring the deed was a step aligned with Tom's wishes, when in reality the draft made clear that Tom intended the house to remain under my control until I passed, and only then to pass to Lily under a condition of kindness that Mark had entirely abandoned. When the judge finally turned to me and asked a few simple questions about my understanding of the deed, transfer, my ability to manage my own finances, and whether I had agreed freely to any of the changes, I answered, calmly, hearing my voice steady and coherent, even as my hands trembled in my lap. She listened to every word, her gaze unwavering, and when I finished, she set her pen down with a soft click that echoed louder than any sound in the room. Mark tried to speak, then launching into an explanation about misunderstanding and insurance, and how he and Vanessa had merely been preparing for my future. But the judge raised a hand and told him firmly that the evidence contradicted his explanations, that his mother was clearly capable of understanding her own affairs, and that transferring a deed without fully informed consent was a serious violation. The ruling came swiftly, as though the truth had been waiting impatiently for someone to acknowledge it out loud. The judge declared the deed transfer void, restoring the property to my name and instructing that it be placed immediately into the irrevocable trust Ethan had prepared. She also ruled that Mark and Vanessa were responsible for returning the pension funds they had diverted, calculating the total between $150,000 and $180,000 depending on interest adjustments, and she entered a civil judgment against them to ensure it would be legally enforceable for years to come. I sat still as the words washed over me, feeling their weight and their justice, sensing Lily tense beside me and then relax in a way I had not seen since she was a small child falling asleep in the back seat after a long drive. The blow to Vanessa's career arrived almost at the same time as the court ruling, because the state real estate board launched a formal investigation into her conduct, reviewing the complaint Ethan had filed and the widespread community reaction on Facebook. They opened an ethics inquiry questioning whether her involvement in the refinance discussions violated trust obligations and whether her behavior represented a risk to future clients. And in the weeks that followed, several of her listings were canceled by anxious homeowners who did not want their properties associated with someone now whispered about as an elder abuser. Vanessa tried to salvage her reputation with statements about misunderstanding and family conflict, but the pressure mounted until she was placed on temporary suspension, while the board reviewed her license, leaving her without income and without the professional identity she had always wielded like a badge. As for the house, I did not return to live in it because the memories there had been bruised too deeply to heal, at least not in the way that would let me sleep peacefully under its roof. Instead, I chose to rent it to a young family with 2 small children, who'd been searching for a stable home in a tight market, offering them a fair rate that gave them room to breathe while providing me with a steady income alongside the storage units and my pension. The day I handed them the keys, I felt something ease inside me, because the house was returning to the purpose Tom and I had always hoped for, becoming a place where someone could grow without fear rather than a battlefield masked as a home. The final twist arrived when Ethan filed a lien against any future income Mark and Vanessa might earn, ensuring that the civil judgment would follow them for years, attaching itself to tax returns, paychecks, and any profitable venture they might attempt. He explained that this measure was not about revenge, but about accountability, making certain that the money they had taken from me would eventually be returned in full, no matter how long it took, and that whenever they tried to rise financially, the weight of their actions would still be there, reminding them of the harm they caused. The idea of the lien hung in the air like a quiet echo of justice, firm, but not cruel, inevitable, but not vengeful. And I realized that this was the true closure I had been seeking, not the spectacle of their downfall, but the assurance that their choices carried lasting consequences. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I felt the sun warm on my face, and for the first time since that awful day in my kitchen, when Mark slid the eviction notice across the table, I could breathe fully again, knowing that the ground beneath me was finally my own, and that the truth had been seen, heard, and validated. Lily squeezed my hand tightly as we stepped onto the sidewalk, and in that moment the world around us felt rewritten. The burden lifted the path ahead, finally opening in a direction I had once feared I would never find. By the end of 2024, the air had cooled into that brittle Spokane winter that makes every breath look like smoke, and life had already carved deep lines into the faces of the people who once believed they could shape mine without consequence. Vanessa lost her real estate license indefinitely after the board concluded she had engaged in conduct inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility, and without her commissions, the polished image she curated for years collapsed almost overnight, forcing them to sell their newer car, then the second one, then several designer pieces she used to flaunt on social media until their feeds went silent. They moved from a 3-bedroom home in a busy suburb to a cramped apartment complex near Division Street, where the walls were thin and the neighbors complained about everything, and the pressure of dwindling savings, public shame, and the civil judgment that attached itself like a shadow broke whatever bond they still had, pushing them first into tense silence, then separate bedrooms, then separate leases, and finally a quiet divorce filing that neither of them announced to anyone. I heard pieces of this from Lily, who kept a small distance, but remained aware enough to ensure I was never blindsided, and when she told me that Mark had been sleeping on a borrowed mattress in a sparsely furnished 1-bedroom apartment, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and clarity. Sorrow because he was still my son, and clarity because his suffering was built brick by brick from choices he made willingly. I had moved to a peaceful senior community on the north side of town, where the hallways smelled faintly of lavender cleaner, and the staff always greeted residents by name, and I filled my small living room with warm lamps, soft blankets, and a single framed photo of Tom smiling at Priest Lake, allowing myself to build a life that felt light rather than weighed down by obligation. One afternoon near the end of November, I heard a soft knock on my door, hesitant and uneven, and when I opened it, I saw Mark standing there in an old winter coat that looked a size too big, his hair uncombed and his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He held a plastic grocery bag in his hand, the kind that crinkles loudly when squeezed, and he gave a weak smile before his voice cracked as he said, "Hi, Mom, I did not know if you would open the door for me." I stepped aside because I would never shut a door in my child's face, but even as he walked in, I felt the memories swirl behind my ribs. Memories of eviction notices slid across my kitchen table, of Vanessa calling me a tax, right off of my thermostat, taped down like I was a child playing with buttons I did not understand. He sat on the small couch, shoulders hunched, hands trembling against the grocery bag, and after a moment, he let out a broken breath and said, "I thought we were planning ahead." "Mom, that is what Vanessa kept telling me. She said you would never understand the financial part and that we were protecting you. I was stupid. I did not question anything. I let her talk, and I believed her because it was easier than doing the work myself." His voice wavered, then cracked fully as tears spilled down his cheeks, something I had not seen since he was a young boy afraid of the dark, and he wiped his face with the back of his hand as though ashamed to let me witness it. "Everything is gone," he whispered. "The job, the house, the marriage I am starting over. I barely have enough for rent. I do not know what to do. Can I stay with you for a while, just until I get back on my feet?" For a long moment the room felt utterly still, as though even the hum of the heater paused to listen, and in that stillness I felt every part of my history with him flood upward, the years of small slights, the months of humiliation, the cold nights wearing extra sweaters, because touching the thermostat was forbidden, the sound of Vanessa telling strangers I was confused the way Mark had stood silently beside her, allowing my dignity to be stripped inch by inch. I loved my son, that truth remained steady inside me, but love could not erase the harm he had allowed, nor could it rebuild trust simply because he now needed something from me. A mother's heart is a flexible thing, but even flexible things have limits. I sat across from him and spoke slowly because I wanted every word to land gently but firmly, and I said, "I will always be your mother. That will never change. And I am not here to punish you for the sake of punishment, but you watch them take everything from me. Mark and you only came here when the consequences finally reached you." His eyes widened with a mix of shame and desperation, and he started to speak, but I raised a hand and continued, because if I stopped, I knew I might soften in ways that would hurt me later. I cannot be your safety net, not anymore, not after what happened, and I am not going to let you move in with me because I worked too hard to build a safe space where no one controls me or my things again. He looked stunned, as though he truly believed apology alone would reset the world, and a part of me ached for the boy he once was. But I held my boundary because I had earned it, with every bruise on my knee, every dismissed bill, every whisper behind my back at church brunch. I did not leave him with nothing, though, because compassion was still part of who I was. So I added, "I can pay for a session with a financial counselor, someone who will help you sort out your debts and start fresh. And I will also cover the cost of one counseling appointment if you want to talk to someone about the choices you made and how to move forward. But that is all I can offer." He nodded slowly, swallowing hard, then asked in a small voice, "What about the trust? Mom, am I still in it? Will I still inherit the house someday?" I inhaled gently because this was the final piece, the one truth he had to hear clearly without softening, and I said, "When I die, you will receive exactly $1, the same symbolic amount listed in the documents, because the real legacy will go to the girl who saved me when no one else listened, and to people who have no one fighting for them." His face drained of color as the weight of those words settled, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak, his mouth opening, then closing again, like he was struggling to breathe through the shock. He whispered Lily, and I nodded because she had earned that place not by blood, but by courage, by the simple act of seeing me when everyone else looked past me. Mark bowed his head, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, and I let him sit there until he could steady himself. Then I stood and walked him to the door, placing a soft hand on his arm, because even now, compassion cost me nothing. When he stepped into the cold winter air, he looked back, once eyes red, and said, "I am sorry," Mom and I replied. "I hope you do better from here." The door closed gently behind him, not slammed, not locked with bitterness, simply closed because some chapters deserve a clear ending, and as I stood in the calm quiet of my living room, I realized that this was the moment the story shifted fully into mine, no longer shaped by what others took, but defined by what I finally reclaimed. By the time the calendar turned to early 2025, the snow around North Spokane had begun its slow melt, leaving small rivers along the sidewalks outside my new building. And every morning when I opened the blinds in my 2-bedroom senior housing apartment, I felt a quiet I had not tasted in years, a quiet that did not depend on anyone's permission, a quiet that belonged entirely to me. The apartment was simple and warm, with wide hallways and soft carpeting that did not squeak under my feet, and I chose it because the staff greeted residents by name and because the common room always smelled faintly of baked cookies, but most of all because no one here hovered over my thermostat or questioned whether I truly needed the groceries I bought. For the first time since Tom passed, I lived like a grown woman again, rather than a burden someone tolerated, and that truth reshaped everything inside me. My income stacked exactly as it should have all along the pension of $9,800 arrived directly into an account with only my name on it. The storage units continued delivering steady monthly checks, and the old house, now rented to a young couple, brought in enough to cover small luxuries without strain. And although I never spent foolishly, it felt strangely new to walk into a store and buy a sturdy pair of shoes or a warm coat without hearing a voice behind me asking whether I really needed it. I realized I had lived so long under someone else's shadow that I had forgotten what self-directed living even felt like, and each small purchase felt like taking back a part of my own mind. Healing did not happen in silence either, because the justice I earned carried me toward purpose rather than bitterness. I returned to my old library twice a week, this time as a volunteer, and the director asked if I would teach a monthly workshop about protecting money as we age, something simple at first. But when word spread through the Spokane Senior Resource Center, attendance doubled and then tripled. Women came with notebooks, men came with folders full of suspicious documents from their own children or caregivers, and every class felt like handing someone a piece of armor they should have had all along. The clips from my workshop that other seniors posted online grew into a small series of local Facebook videos, and soon people from nearby towns messaged the library asking whether we would host online sessions for those who could not travel. I never expected to become any sort of teacher again, but life has a way of circling back to the versions of ourselves we thought we had left behind. Lily came to almost every session sitting in the back, listening with a seriousness far beyond her 17 years. And afterward, she would ask me questions about laws, rights, and paperwork with an intensity that made Ethan smile when I told him. She became what I jokingly called my mini advocate, explaining to her friends why older adults need privacy with their finances and why it is important to speak up when something feels wrong. And her teachers noticed her new interest. She told me she might want to become a lawyer or a social worker someday, someone who protects people who do not always know how to protect themselves, and I felt a deep, warming pride that settled in my chest every time I looked at her. She was the one who saw me when everyone else chose not to, and she turned that courage into something that stretched far beyond our family. Her future felt secure in a way Mark never understood, because the trust Ethan helped me finalize held everything. Tom and I built the storage units, the bonds, the real estate, even the old house, once the deed was safely returned, and I structured it so that Lily would receive half of the income when I passed, but with one condition that reflected the lesson we learned together. The trust required her to continue supporting vulnerable seniors, even if only a little, whether by volunteering, sharing resources, or donating part of her inheritance, and she accepted the condition with a quiet nod and a determination in her eyes that reminded me so strongly of Tom that I had to look away for a moment. The other portion of the trust was designated for a Spokane foundation dedicated to helping elders experiencing financial abuse, ensuring that a story like mine would not be lost in the maze of family silence again. Mark and Vanessa's lives settled into a long tale of consequences rather than catastrophe, and that was exactly the kind of justice I believed in, firm but realistic, because not every villain goes to prison, but they all face the weight of their choices eventually. The civil judgment stayed attached to their names, lowering credit scores, blocking loans, and resurfacing any time they tried to build something financially stable. And although it was not my goal to destroy them, it was appropriate that the money they once siphoned from me had become an anchor on their future. Vanessa tried to return to real estate, but most firms refused to take someone whose name had circulated widely in Facebook groups as a warning example, so she bounced between freelance sales jobs and temporary contracts, telling anyone who would listen that she had been misunderstood. Mark found work in warehouse logistics steady enough but far from comfortable, and while he never complained to me directly, Lily told me he lived simply and avoided conversations about the past as though speaking the truth out loud might crack him open again. I did not hate him when I thought about all of this, but I did not soften either because growth requires accountability, and accountability cannot exist without boundaries. Some evenings I sat alone in my apartment, wrapped in a knitted blanket, sipping tea, and I thought about how strange it was that losing my house had not been the worst part of my story. No, the worst part had been realizing that my own child found stealing from me easier than sitting down to talk to me like a human being, easier than admitting he was overwhelmed or afraid or simply unprepared for adulthood. That revelation cut deeper than any eviction notice or frozen bank account, and acknowledging it out loud was the final step in freeing myself from the part of motherhood that demanded self-sacrifice without reciprocity. One morning, as I prepared materials for a new library workshop, I paused and looked straight ahead, speaking aloud in the quiet room as though answering an invisible listener, saying I thought losing my house would break me. I really did, but it did not. Because the truth is, the house was only walls and wood. The real break came when I realized my child believed I was easier to steal from than to stand up for. And the real healing came when I finally said no. I knew these words would sit with the women who heard them later, women who had been quietly giving parts of themselves away for decades, women who needed permission to choose themselves at last. So if my story echoes even slightly with your mother's life, your grandmother's life, or your own, I hope you will share it because someone in your town might be living this in silence tonight, and your one comment or share might be the folder that finally helps them step out of the dark. And before you go, tell me where you are listening from tonight or any night, because every city has a Helen and every Helen deserves to be free.